Welcome to the session on Introduction to Management System Standards. In the first session, we saw ISO 9001 and a number of other management system standards that had been developed by international agency, the International Organization for Standardization, as well as industry specific standards. We also discussed one of the needs of the stakeholders about having a common structure for these management system standards, which would help them to implement all these standards better. We also said that we also saw that the ISO had come out with a high level structure which provided a common basis for the development of these management system standards. So, in this session we are going to have a look at what this high level structure is and how it is different from what the structure that the management system standards had in the past, and how this structure is going to help the industry. This structure is part of an ISO document called the ISO Guide 2, which provides a basis for the development of all ISO standards. So, the structure for management system standards is a part of this document and is available at Annex SL. So, Annex SL provides a framework for all ISO management system standards, providing first a high level structure. What this would mean is the individual management system standards could still have some changes, minor changes subject to certain conditions when they are returned. This annex also provides identical subclause titles, so that the users will not have to deal with different topics or the same subjects. It also has identical text for most of these clauses and a common terms and core definitions that are applicable across management system standards or defined in this document. Why was Annex SL created? We did see the need for a common structure. So, quite obviously this Annex SL was created by the ISO to create a common text framework which will be easier for organizations to utilize and for auditors to audit against. Most of these standards are certifiable in the sense that organizations can demonstrate that they are conforming to these standards by having independent third party auditors to audit against these standards and provide them a certificate. So, obviously it is going to be better for the auditors to audit organizations that implement a number of these management system standards. One of the objectives is also to improve the effectiveness and the value of management system standards. We will be shortly seeing how this value addition takes place in terms of the new requirements that are stipulated in this Annex SL. Some of the key changes that have been identified in this high level structure, the most important one would be a requirement for context of the organization. Those who are familiar with the ISO 9001, the earlier versions, would recall that this requirement, the text that we are seeing now, the context of the organization, was not really explicitly present in the standard. The high level structure requires that all management systems have this clause, and what this would mean is it is a requirement for the organizations to understand its context both in terms of the internal and external issues. In fact, this is a requirement that is going to push the organizations to think in terms of how sustainable they are and what they need to do if they need to survive in the environment in which it is placed. This Annex SL, this particular clause also has a requirement for the organizations to identify its interested parties and understand their needs and expectations. Quite obviously, any organization would have a number of interested parties or stakeholders who could be customers, who could be the organizations from whom they make their purchases, it could be the society at large, because especially if it is an environmental management systems, a key stakeholder or a key interested party would be the society that lives around the organization. It could be the shareholders who have invested in an organization. It is not always necessary that the needs and expectations of these different groups of interested parties would be the same, but it is very important for an organization to understand what each stakeholder or an interested party requires, what their expectations are, and then manage it in a way that there is a balance of meeting the requirements of these stakeholders. There is a clause 4.3 under this clause, context of the organization requires the organizations to determine the scope of its management systems. The scope for a QMS and the scope of the management system for an environmental management system for the same organizations could be different. The high level structure also has a clause 7 which is titled support. This section seems to have grouped a number of clauses. For example, the responsibility and authority and communication and resource management, which was present in different parts of the standards in the earlier versions, would now be grouped under this clause. The most notable change is in relation to documentation. The requirements are very light, in the sense there is no requirement for documented procedures of any kind. Of course, it does not mean that the organizations would not have any, but there is no specific requirement within the standard to require organizations to write down everything that they do. 9001 or 14001, the QMS or the EMS may contain additional requirements, of course. So, there is some kind of flexibility, some amount of flexibility that is given to the individual technical committees to add requirements that are needed for a specific management systems, but those will have to be justified to the ISO committee which looks into the common structure. We know from the ISO 9001 which is now available that it does not contain any additional requirements here. So, that is a significant change. There is a clause 8 which is titled operation, and this section is a good example of how the current versions of the standards do not align well. I mean, that is a justification you would provide for having this high level structure. If you are more familiar with ISO 14001, you might be looking into a clause 446 which is titled operational control, and if you are familiar with ISO 9001, you would be thinking about clause 7 which talks of planning of product realization right through to preservation of produce, the entire sequence of operations that is required to produce a product. So, obviously, there were the similar operations or similar requirements covered under different clauses with different titles. So, a bit of a reorganization and standardization of clauses and terms has been done under this clause. An example of how scheme specific clauses will be incorporated, as we would see in ISO 14001, emergency planning and response, you would find it under operations, but this is not a clause that you would find in ISO 9001. We have clause 9 which is performance evaluation and clause 10 which is improvement. The content of both these clauses are largely familiar because most of the requirements under these clauses were present in the earlier versions of the standard, perhaps under a different heading. Let us look at one example of how this new management system standards are structured. ISO 45001 is a standard under development. This is a management system dealing with occupational health and safety. So, this follows a high level structure in Annex SL. There is a new standard being developed, so it is that much easier rather than rewriting the old standards. So, we will have a look at what is the structure of this new standard. So, ISO 45001 will more easily integrate with other ISO management system standards including 9001 and 14001. 45001 eventually is expected to replace an industry specific document, OSHA's 18001. The standard of course builds into a concept of PDCA, the plan, do, check, act cycle. So, this is the basis for management system standard as we have seen earlier. Looking into the structure, you would find the context of the organization, which means that the organizations will have to consider where it is located, how it is placed, who its neighbors are, what are the external factors that could have a bearing on the operations of the organizations, as well as the internal issues that might affect the way that it functions. So, both internal and external issues need to be considered under the context of the organization. This will help them to establish the scope of their OSHAs. Then we have the management, the leadership clause number 5, which is central to any organization. Unless the leadership is committed, the organizations will not sustain itself for too long, and we have the other clauses of the standard that you would see in the diagram. The support and operations under clause 7 and 8, the performance evaluations which is under clause 9, which includes the monitoring and measurement operations, and the improvement under clause 10. All this would feed back into the planning operation which is covered under clause 6. So, you would see that the standard does incorporate the plan, do, check, act cycle, the famous Deming cycle for an organization to continuously improve its performance. So, what is the output of the system is the intended outcomes of the OSHAs, or the occupational health and safety management systems. So, the structure of the standard would be something like this. There are 10 clauses that is defined in the high level structure SL, Annex SL, starting with scope, what the standard is intended to achieve and what is the extent of applicability. You would have clause number 2 that deals with the normative references. You would have clause number 3 that has the terms and definitions. Then the context of the organization, we saw that the internal and external issues need to be considered here. Then there is the leadership, the planning part where the requirement for evaluating the risk, the opportunities and threats is also included, and we have the support clauses where it talks about the resources that are needed, and we have the operations, the performance evaluation and the improvement. So, you would find these 10 clauses in any management system standard. So, what does this clause 4 contain? The context of the organization. The understanding the organization and its context would mean that you find out the external and internal issues that could affect the organizations and base your management systems to make sure that the organization continues to sustain in wherever it is situated. Understanding the needs and expectations of the interested parties would mean that you provide evidence, you consider all stakeholders of an organization, you understand what they need and what their expectations are. Then you have the other clause 4.3 that is determining the scope, and as I had explained earlier, for the same organization the scope of a quality management system, the environmental management system, the occupational health and safety management systems could be different. Then we have the entire management system which is defined briefly. Clause 5, the leadership, has 3 subclauses. Clause 5.1 which talks about the leadership and commitment, 5.2 which defines the policy which could be specific to the type of management system that we are discussing, a quality policy, an environmental related policy or an occupational health and safety related policy. Then there is a clause 5.3 which talks about the organizational roles, responsibilities, accountabilities and authorities, and clause 6 talks about the planning actions to address the risks and opportunities. We saw that one of the purposes of this high level structure was to make sure that the organizations do consider the risks and the threats and opportunities that the organizations can effectively leverage to meet their own objectives and their goals. So, this clause has subclauses which includes hazard identification, determination of legal and other requirements, assessment of risks, planning for change and planning to take action. Remember that this standard we are discussing about occupational health and safety. So, for a quality management system the title of some of these subclauses would be different, and so also for the environmental management systems. Clause 6.2 would talk about the objectives and how the organization plans to achieve them. The support clause talks about the resources that are required, which includes the human resources, and when we talk about the human resources, the first thing that comes to our mind is competence. That is under clause 7.2. We talk about awareness, which would be a critical requirement for any kind of management system. People within the organization need to be aware of what they are expected to do. They need to be aware of what is to be done when there is an adverse situation. So, awareness is a key requirement for all management systems and in particular for occupational health and safety management system. Clause 7.4 talks about information, communication, participation and consultation. Clause 7.5 talks about documented information. We saw earlier that there is no need for extensive procedures to be written, but the documented information clause covers what is required to be provided in the form of documents. For instance, a quality policy, the objectives will have to be documented, and so also the results of any process. If you do a testing, the information needs to be documented. All that, the requirement for procedures, whatever the minimum requirement that is needed, as well as the records management would be covered under this clause, documented information. Clause 8 talks about operational planning and control. We have clause 8.1.1, which is a general statement you would find, 8.1.2 that talks about the hierarchy of control, which is again a OSHA's specific title. Then we have clause 8.2, the management of change. 8.3 talks about outsourcing. There is a separate ISO standard on outsourcing, but here we were talking about the processes that are required for the system. In case they are outsourced, then the requirements of this clause would be applicable. Clause 8.4 talks about procurement, 8.5 on contractors, 8.6 emergency preparedness and response, which again is a OSHA specific requirement. Clause 9 talks about performance evaluation. It is a familiar one. The monitoring, measurement, analysis and evaluation talks about evaluation of compliance, which will include all the compliance to the legal requirements, and clause 9.2 talks about internal audits, a critical tool for making sure that the systems are effective. So, the internal audit objectives, internal audit process need to be described under this clause, and 9.3 talks about the management review. We have clause 10, the improvement, which deals with the how any incident or any non-conformity is handled and how corrective actions can emanate from other feedback that is received, including complaints, and then continual improvement, which is a key goal for this management system standards. So, this would be the structure of the OSHA standard, which is under development. This is expected to be brought out during the course of this year. Having seen the structure, having seen the basic objectives of management system standards, let us just have a brief look at what the management system standards are intended to do and are they really being used effectively by the industry. So, this is quite important to understand that we may have a good standard, but when it is implemented, the implementation could have certain issues. So, the next few slides would also suggest how the standards could be used effectively by all stakeholders, including the certification bodies. The standards are produced for businesses to use and benefit from. Organizations that embrace management systems benefit from them. What it means is that if an organization implements the standard in letter and spirit, the spirit part is important, then quite clearly it would be beneficial for them. But then there are organizations that just want a certificate. We have seen this happening with ISO 9001. The number of certificates that are issued globally across, it is more than 1 lakh, and some of the organizations quite clearly do not really measure up to the certificate that they have. So, systems, management systems, they consider as just a superficial overlay. They need a certificate at some cost, at any cost, and management system is often seen as a pain. There is a disconnect between the senior management and management system itself. So, under these circumstances, obviously the benefits that are expected out of the management system are not going to accrue to that organization. So, the superficial adoption of management system devalues management systems globally. Certification, we have seen earlier that there are third parties which are expected to be independent and they certify organizations as meeting the requirements of this management system standards. This is a big business globally, and the certification is of course here to stay. So, it is quite clearly it is necessary that the certification adds value to the businesses rather than just providing a certificate for hanging on the wall. The standards are written for businesses quite clearly, and it is not for auditors, but certification is an important area because there are stakeholders who need these organizations to be certified as meeting the requirements, because the organizations operate on a global basis and not everyone can really get an assurance that the organizations do meet the requirements. So, certification, as I said, has become a big business globally. The value of certification can directly impact the actual value of perceived value of the management system standards. If for instance, the certification is again something that the certification bodies think as only a business and issue a certificate without really following the letter and spirit of the standard, we are going to have the market flooded with certificates which really mean nothing. So, there is a pressure on the certification bodies, so we need to accept this, that to accept superficial adoption of the management system standards, as it is a very competitive market. But in this kind of a market, what should the certification bodies do? The auditor competence becomes a key area, and quality of certification quite obviously depends on how competent the auditors are. So, the certification bodies will have to focus on the competence of their auditors that they use, and this has become a topic of increasing debate globally. The ISO 17021 standard, which is a standard meant for certification bodies, highlights this aspect, and there are several ISO documents that have been developed which define the competence required by auditors of various management system standards. Poor auditors clearly devalue certification, which in turn devalues management system standards. Unfortunately, the ISO is not in control or is involved in prescribing what auditor competence is. They do write the standards, but when it comes to verifying whether the auditors are really competent or not, the ISO is not involved in any way. So, it is all up to the certification bodies or accreditation bodies. Standards being produced separately and with different structures, this is creating a problem, we had seen that. So, in reality, a business has one management systems, that is the business management system. So, obviously, for an organization, this is the core, that the business should continue to thrive and they would be ready to do whatever is required for achieving that objective. So, when it comes to Annex SL, we said that how this is going to help the businesses focus on the strategies and at the same time make sure that they do have good management systems in place. Annex SL is expected to raise the standards, the ISO 9001 or the 14001 or the other management systems to the level of the boardroom, which means that the directors, the key functionaries within organizations are expected to be involved in developing the standards. For instance, we saw that there is a requirement for the context of the organization, which unless the key functionaries including the promoters or the directors are involved, really would not be possible to decide appropriately. So, for organizations that embrace the management system standards, like I said earlier, for organizations that implement the standards in letter and spirit, there will be very little effect with the introduction of the high level structure. But for organizations that have been taking a superficial approach and are only interested in a certificate, the changes are quite very much significant. So, the clauses that have made it less easy to hold the system at arm's length for the top management and put pressure on the organization to utilize the standards the way that they were originally intended are the following. Certification bodies should consider the context currently. This is an advice for the certification bodies and the risks and opportunities that exist to them. With that information, determine whether there may be advantage in proactively tackling the issues presented here to position themselves as the market leaders in this regard. There are serious minded organizations in the market which would like to approach good certification bodies which can deliver effective certification, and so this is an opportunity for certification bodies to position themselves as market leaders by following the new standard and the new structure. So, in conclusion, Annex SL is a lot more than just a common framework for management system standards. It does provide a framework for the different technical committees of ISO to write their management system standards, but it is just more than that. The new clauses that we have seen, some of them which includes the context of the organizations, the evaluation of risks, opportunities, threats and opportunities, they are intended actually to align standards with businesses. The new clauses intend to help stop the devaluing of management system standards through superficial adoption, low level auditing and meaningless certification. So, hopefully this would be achieved, but we still have to wait and see how certification bodies react to the new high level structure. So, Annex SL will require an increase in auditor competence if certification is to be seen as beneficial to businesses. Thank you.